In this video, I want to talk to you about some of the misconceptions of grief. In our society, oftentimes grief is misunderstood. And instead of people supporting people on their grief journey, they get in the way of it. In other words, these misconceptions become hurdles to the healing process. Let me talk about 5 of the ones that you may have encountered. The first misconception is that grief and mourning are the same. According to Alan Wolfelt, grief and mourning are not the same. And I want to just distinguish the difference to help us have a better understanding of how these two really go hand in hand. Grief is defined by Wolfelt as the internal thoughts and feelings that you have after a loss. So it's what's going on the inside. Mourning, on the other hand, is described as that outward expression of the inward feelings and thoughts. So you can see why both of these are important. So if people are thinking that they're fully grieving, but there's no outward expression, then you only have half of what you need to grieve. And what I've learned and what I noticed is that people need to both experience the internal realities and have that validated, but they also need to be able to express that outwardly. Being a part of groups, talking to other people, having rituals, having ceremonies, opportunities to outwardly express, to take their grief out loud into their world, with the people that they love and care about. So that's misconception number 1. Grief and mourning are the same. They are not. Second misconception is that grief is predictable and also orderly. You may have heard of the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. Now, originally, that particular framework was not designed to be a linear pathway that everybody follows to go through grief. It was actually designed for those that were dying, not for those who were living and grieving the death of those that they love. But what's happened over the years is that particular 5 stages of grief have become prescriptive for people, but that is just not people's reality. Grief is so individual and it's all over the map. And there is no linear process to it. It's unique for everyone. So it's important to be able to take this misconception that says it's predictable and say grief is not predictable. It's different for everybody, and you have to find your own pathway. Yes, there are principles that we can follow and we can learn from some of these frameworks, but it's unique, and your grief will be different from the person sitting right beside you. The third misconception that sometimes we run into, that's a hurdle to our healing, is it's best to move away from your grief, not towards it. And here we bump into some societal norms that people become very uncomfortable with all of the emotion and the experience of grief. But the way to deal with grief is to go towards it, not to run away from it. If we don't deal with grief, then we will never find that healing. And grief that is paid attention to is the very grief that we can process and deal with and work through. And there are times, yes, we need to dose our grief. We need to take it in bite-sized pieces. But when it shows up, it's inviting us, it's asking us to pay attention to it and to move towards it, because it's only as we move towards our grief that we actually move through our grief. Well, the fourth misconception goes something like this. Tears are a sign of weakness. That is just not true. Tears are something that are built into us for many different reasons. One of the reasons I believe tears are put into the human body, into the human experience, is it's a way of releasing tension. It's nature's way of releasing tension. And it's learning. We have to learn how to cry well. And I believe we need to learn how to cry deeply, not just shallow tears, but deep tears, because oftentimes that is the pressure valve that needs to be released to let go of some of that pain and some of that hurt. The fifth misconception of grief is the goal of grief is to get over it. And you maybe have heard this from friends or family members. Aren't you over it by now? Aren't you over your loss or through your grief by now? Well, the reality is that we never get over grief. It stays with us throughout our lives. And what I believe to be true is that life can actually become larger, but the grief remains a part of your life as a cherished memory that you want to hold on to. A better way to frame it is for us to learn to reconcile and be reconciled to the losses in our lives, to integrate them into a bigger life that is emerging over time. So there's some misconceptions, and I would encourage you to think about what are some other ones that you've heard or that you're experiencing on your grief journey, and reflect on those as well. But here are 5 that if you can identify them as an actual hurdle to healing, you'll be able to counteract them with proactivity and to be able to lean into your grief journey to find the healing and the hopefulness that you desire.